propose to take questions 10 to 13 together. I chaired a meeting of Cabinet Committee D, which deals principally with infrastructure, on the 31st of January, and a Cabinet Committee meeting of Committee B, Social Policy and Public Services, on the 21st of February. Cabinet Committee D works to ensure a coordinated approach to the delivery of work and the ongoing development of policy across areas of infrastructure, investment and delivery, housing and climate action. It also provides political oversight in relation to Project Ireland 2040. Significant work is underway across each of these areas through government departments and agencies and a range of interdepartmental groups, such as the Climate Action High-Level Steering Group and the Project Ireland 2040 Delivery Board. Cabinet Committee B covers social policy and public services, including education, children, social inclusion, the Irish language, arts and culture, and continued improvements and reform of public services. In addition, these matters are regularly considered at meetings of the government itself.
Deputy Martin.
You will remember that in 2017 you informed the House that you were reorganising the Cabinet Committee structures in order that they would become more active. Since then, a pattern has emerged of Cabinet Committees being at best marginal to the issues which they are supposed to be handling. The facts show that in areas such as health, housing, Brexit, Northern Ireland and other major areas of public concern, the Cabinet Committees have met irregularly. You recently justified this by saying that you prefer to have the discussions at a full Cabinet meeting. And the implication of this, of course, is that you prefer to have the discussions without the detailed advanced work circulated to departments, without key officials present and as part of much fuller agendas in limited time. I would also point out to you, Taoiseach, that you generally hold these discussions without putting them on the agenda sometimes, or at least this is what is implied by the failure of your staff to note these discussions when explaining the Cabinet agenda in different contexts, including the press briefing on Tuesday afternoons. If we look at the Infrastructure Committee, Taoiseach, which I think met in January, it's very clear that it's not on top of the National Development Plan at all, or has very little relationship with it. That's very evident from the massive overspend on the National Children's Hospital, for example, which will have an impact on the wider NDP, and the capacity undermines the capacity to deliver other projects. And this turns up time and time again with different committees that seem very much out of touch with various crises in different departments. Can you overall explain to me, Taoiseach, why you think it's better not to have detailed advanced staff work done or key officials present when discussing these hugely important issues? And that's what used to happen at Cabinet subcommittees. There was a more intensive, specific look at issues and not one of just a glance at a fuller plenary session of the Cabinet.
Now, Deputy MacDonald.
So, Taoiseach, if I've understood your response correctly, there has been no Cabinet Committee discussion or meeting on health so far into 2019. Yesterday, I'm sure you know, the Euro Health Consumer Index for 2018 was published, and it found once again that we have the worst hospital waiting lists in Europe. And this is consistent with the latest figures published by the National Treatment Purchase Fund earlier this month, which shows that hospital waiting lists have reached record levels. Over 523,000 patients waiting for an outpatient consultation and over 72,000 waiting for an inpatient procedure. The situation in respect of hospital waiting lists is out of control, Taoiseach, and the Minister for Health and your government continue with your flawed and failed plans. What we need is sustained, intelligent investment in the public health system to tackle these waiting lists, and that needs to be done through the full implementation of Sláinte Care to ensure that there are significant financial and health benefits for the state and for patients in the long term. Can I ask you, Taoiseach, if your department is still involved in the delivery of Sláinte Care and what precise role your department has in that regard?
Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Taoiseach, have any of your Cabinet subcommittees discussed the issue of the plan to impose 23% VAT on food supplements that led people to protest yet again outside the Dáil this morning. I heard in response to earlier questions, and indeed we challenged the Minister a couple of weeks ago, myself and Jean O'Kenny, about this. The response is it's nothing to do with us, it's to do with revenue. Now, I want to suggest to you, Taoiseach, that that's nonsense. There is an EU directive that says that food supplements are food. They are food, right? They're categorised as food. Therefore, the distinction that revenue has decided to impose after years of having the zero rate and saying there's food and then there's food supplements, and we're going to lash 23% on them, put a lot of people out of business, and mean that now food supplements that Europe categorises as food and are actually very important for the health of ordinary people will now be out of the reach of huge numbers of people. And less well-off people, it's important to say, Taoiseach, will be hit hardest by this, because rich people can absorb a 23% increase and still get their supplements. But less well-off people will now not be able to access these supplements. And you're standing back and saying, it's nothing to do with us, right? Actually, it is something to do with us. It's to do with people's health, it's to do with fairness, and it is to do with a fairly bizarre interpretation, frankly, by revenue, when there is a clear directive from Europe saying food supplements are food, and therefore should not be subject to this 23% increase.
Deputy Howland.
Firstly, can I just say that I've raised it already. I know the issue of the food supplements today. I've raised it at least 3 times previously, and I would ask the Taoiseach, notwithstanding what he said earlier, to just reflect further on this, because fundamental tax policy should not be made by the revenue, as if it was not the purview of the government or this House. And I'd ask him to reflect upon that again. But I want to ask you just a specific question in relation to the operation of Cabinet subcommittees, because the Taoiseach has redesigned them from the ones that I was familiar with in my own time in government. And I'm wondering, are you satisfied that they are actually working as sort of catch-all department? You like the catch-all phrase, obviously, a catch-all website for the government. But the notion that you can deal with health matters in a general committee, or that you can deal with housing in a general committee, or the Garda reform agenda in a general committee. I think that the practice, it took an awful lot of time, every Monday virtually, long days going through specific committees, and I happen to be ex officio member, I think, of all Cabinet subcommittees. But you had all the key officials there, and you were able to deal with issues. I just asked the Taoiseach, obviously experimentation is a good thing, but are you satisfied that the new general committees, where you amalgamate a number of different topics, actually is working?
From the information you've given us there's been one Cabinet subcommittee, I think, in January, and one Cabinet subcommittee in February, if I heard you right. So that basically means that, excluding a month off in August, we have a maximum of 11 Cabinet subcommittee meetings a year. Now, I understand and appreciate that you've told us before your dislike of the system of Cabinet subcommittees, but maybe it is an explanation for some of the areas where there are real holes in the performance by this government, because perhaps, I just put it to you, Taoiseach, you're not getting the kind of detailed information that not just you, as the leader of the government, requires, but actually the other members of the government need as well. I mean, I wonder, for instance, how many Cabinet subcommittees, on average, would Minister Ross attend? How many would he be entitled to attend, even though he's the leader of the other party in government, and then you have 2 independents? So I can understand that you yourself presumably meet your Fine Gael colleagues quite a lot, but how do you actually arrange to meet the other partners in government, Deputy Ross's party and the 2 independent ministers? It just seems to me, unless maybe you arrange to meet them privately, but you're very busy, so I doubt if you've that much time to do all of that. I mean, this could be the explanation for what the problem is in housing. And this is why maybe there's such a blind on things like social housing and affordable housing, notwithstanding that other forms of housing are increasing. Because I think we're all genuinely perplexed. This government has a lot of resources, came into a very good situation, housing, health, a number of other issues. The failure really to deliver is pretty disappointing.
Thanks very much, Deputy, for your questions again. There are a lot of Cabinet meetings, and I'm somebody who very much believes in Cabinet government and collective responsibility, and including all ministers in decision making. And that's actually the best way, I believe, to particularly when there are only a small number of independents around the table, the best way to include them in all decision making is to make all the big decisions at Cabinet meetings when they're present, because they wouldn't all be present at every Cabinet meeting. So the best way to ensure that you have a cohesive government, that everyone is present when the big decisions are made, is actually to make them at Cabinet meetings when every minister is present. I really didn't like the EMC system which operated under the previous government, and I appreciate there are two former members of the EMC here, and they'd perhaps be protective of that system. And I very much disliked it because you had a sort of an inner group or a sort of inner cabinet of Cabinet members who made decisions and then sort of bounced them on at the last minute on the whole Cabinet without an opportunity for due consideration, often 20 or 30-page documents arriving in front of you at 1:10 on a Tuesday, and that's no longer the practice in this government. So it's a vast improvement on what we had in the previous government in terms of collective decision making, everyone actually being involved in making the decision, people getting papers before the meeting actually happens, rather than big decisions being made at the last minute by often post-diktat by the EMC and the members of the EMC. Cabinet obviously meets at least once a week, sometimes more frequently. We'll have 2 meetings next week, maybe 3 in fact, and again, that's the way I like to run things. There are also lots of Cabinet subcommittees. We've one nearly every week, and it does depend on the issue. So Brexit, for example, that committee almost never meets now because we discuss Brexit at every single Cabinet meeting. There is an officials group, of course, that's separate, but when it comes to Brexit, it affects everyone, and I want everyone around the table, and we spent at least the best part of an hour on that today, and will again next week. But there are often areas that don't involve everyone, but do involve a number of departments. And that is where the Cabinet subcommittees come in very useful. And Deputy Howell mentioned Garda Reform, for example, and the Garda Reform programme, and our response to the O'Toole Commission's recommendations went to Cabinet Committee before it went to the full Cabinet, because that wasn't something that involved everyone, but it did involve a critical mass of ministers. So that, for example, went to Cabinet Subcommittee before going to full Cabinet. Last week, for example, the Cabinet Subcommittee on Infrastructure focused on the interagency report on homelessness, because that didn't impact everyone, but did impact 4 or 5 departments, health, justice, social protection, for example, and they were the ones who were there. And we also discussed the advances that Minister Zappone is making on realising the affordable childcare scheme at Cabinet Subcommittee last week. So there's different mechanisms. There's Cabinet, where everyone is there, all the politicians who hold ministerial office around the table with the Secretary-General of Government. There's Cabinet subcommittees, which can come in useful too, but there is a downside with so many ministers on each committee, plus their officials and advisors. These are meetings of 30 and 40 people, and anyone who attends meetings knows the difference between a meeting of 10 people and a meeting of 40 people in terms of getting things done. And I also meet ministers bilaterally. In fact, I'm in the process at the moment of meeting each minister individually with their Sec-Gen and their main advisor to review progress and work in their various departments. I think Deputy MacDonald mentioned the European Health Consumer Index, which was out in the last couple of days. Neglected to mention that we actually went up in that. I think we went up by 2 points. It generally is major news when we go down, but when we go up, it barely makes the news at all. But on this occasion, we actually went up the rankings in terms of the quality of our health service. I think went up about 2 points. But it is important to take these things with a pinch of salt. It is a private company based in Sweden. It's not the WHO or the Lancet, but it's still an interesting index nonetheless. On waiting lists, she's quite right that it's an area where we haven't made sufficient progress. But there are different waiting lists. The waiting list for operations and procedures is actually very much going in the right direction. As of the end of last year, the number of patients waiting for an operation or a procedure, hip, an eye, a cataract, a knee replacement, I think was at a 4 or 5 year low. Now, it went up in January as a consequence of the time lost around the nurses' strike, and I think will obviously go up in February too for the same reason. But from March again, I think we'll be once again on a downward trajectory. And that means that most people who are public patients waiting for an operation or procedure in Ireland now wait between 3 and 6 months, which actually is a significant improvement on where we were not too long ago. On outpatients, we're not making much progress, and we need a new approach there. Roughly 300,000 people waiting more than 12 weeks. I use 12 weeks because that's the Sláintecare target. Often those headline figures you see around waiting lists actually include people waiting 1 week or 2 weeks or 6 weeks. You'll always have people waiting 1 week or 2 weeks or 6 weeks. But the figure in Sláintecare is waiting more than 12 weeks, and that's the figure I always look out for. And there are roughly 300,000 people now waiting more than 12 weeks to see a specialist, but there are 500,000 appointments that are no-shows. So there's a real problem there in terms of planning and efficiency that we haven't got on top of, and I think there are potential solutions, but a lot of them are IT-based and other things need to be done too. On the implementation of Sláintecare, that's being run out of the Sláintecare Implementation Office, which is in the Department of Health. But I will be putting some officials on that in the same way as I have officials designated to monitor the implementation of the Garda reform package and Justice reform package. I'll be assigning officials to do the same with Sláintecare. In relation to the question on VAT on supplements, I answered questions on this earlier today on questions of promised legislation. So I won't repeat myself, but just to summarise, this is a revenue determination. The policy is that for oral medicines and for fresh food, the VAT rate is 0, but for processed food, VAT does apply.